there's a communication cycle in all of this. You begin by understanding a population, then you start to develop messages, disseminate these messages, you start engaging the population, and then you can inform users and market the system. These are distinct steps, which I think are very important to know. And basically, we should always start by understanding a population. What we found in many of these cases is that many communication strategies, many promotional strategies, or many information guidelines for systems normally only include the ideas of the people who are developing it. So this is a very important topic. I mean, the whole volume of communications is always wondering, how can we get every BRT system to have a dedicated team working on communications, and that they have steps to include the people and to ask people and to get their views, and to, based on that, define the entire strategy of communications from the beginning. I'm going to be focusing much more on that part of the communication cycle, because everything else is normally what people are already doing. And that's sort of one of the main things that we tried to do when we were developing this. So bear in mind that there's this cycle. This is sort of one of the internal documents that we prepared for the creation of this document, but I think it's worthwhile to have in your minds. So then there's some initial questions, which I thought were really important that you ask yourselves if you are being part of a BRT system, if you're part of a management team, or if you're doing anything related to BRT. Think about the last time that you saw planners or system designers asking neighbors about designs. And what's important here is that we need to ask ourselves if planners are asking neighbors about the designs of a BRT in the appropriate moment. Because many times what we see is that when government comes to talk to people and starts to present these designs, they show them the final designs, not the preliminary designs. And it's basically because they're a little bit afraid that people will be asking them much more about what could be changed about a design. So this is the first question. Why does that happen, and how can we change that? And from my experience, it's something that could be addressed much better. Then the next question is, how much do you know about your stakeholders' interests and their mandate? Basically, do you know what people are thinking about a system, what they want from the system, and how they can either support its development or stop the system? I'm going to talk much more in detail about this, how to understand these groups and how to integrate them. Then another question that I'm always asking in every conference that somebody's talking about communications is, what is the budget that is being spent? How much money have people spent in communications or in marketing or even in understanding a population? You'll find that the percentage is very low. And that anyway, it's pretty cheap to do a full communication strategy when you compare it to the complete development of the system. So you can spend maybe a little bit more than is normally used in all the steps that are normally not taken, which I'm going to talk. And then a very, very specific question that I'm going to answer towards the end of the presentation. How much time have users spent looking at a system's map? We did that actually. We did an exercise where we were looking at exactly how much time people were spending looking at the system's map and what they did after that. And the results were really interesting. I'm going to present them later, but when you see that people do not really understand the map or do not really understand the way the system works, then maybe it's because you haven't asked them properly what they would like to see. There's good examples and bad, but that's sort of one of the things that I'm going to be talking about more towards the end. So there's the first chapter of this volume. It's the one on strategic planning for communications. The first full draft was produced by me and Lake. And then we had Jamila Magnuson from ITDP and Liz London continue until it was published. This, I copied here the table of contents of each chapter so that you know what's there. I'm going to be describing some of these things, not all, because I have a lot of material and I prefer to just focus on the more important things from my point of view, or the things that are generally not so well known. Of course, there's a lot of planning in communications, goals and objectives. There's one thing that I'm going to be talking about mostly. It's about stakeholders and how to identify those target groups and a little bit of the tools that you can use. I won't be talking so much about the message development or targeting the message. So that's one thing that you have to go to the planning guide and read about. I'm able to respond questions at any point, either now or later, about these things. But that's sort of in more in detail in the planning guide. The same as the tactics. I mean, in the end, there are already a lot of guidelines, not from transport, but from everywhere, where they say which are the typical dissemination tactics that you have to bear in mind. So let's think first about how we should identify stakeholders, evaluate stakeholders, what type of things we can do. There's this very simple graph. It's in the planning guide, and basically what it's showing is the influence or the power of the stakeholders in the vertical axis and the interest of the stakeholders in the horizontal axis. Sometimes they have names, the champions or the people who don't have interest, but regardless of their names, of course, the key player in order to promote and help promote the BRT is going to be the group of people or the stakeholders who have the greatest influence and power and great interest. In BRT, this is not normally a very large group. It's normally government, and it's normally some other groups who know very well about transport and who have a very big interest, sometimes NGOs. In some cases, this is not very common to see a lot of people sort of supporting a new idea, especially when it's very new, especially when it's BRT in a city that has mostly informal transport. What you have is people who are not necessarily convinced and who you have to engage. And this is one of the messages of stakeholders. There's people who don't have much interest but have a lot of power. These are the people who we have to meet their needs and then maybe turn to somebody who would have more interest. There's some people who have a lot of interest but have little power. This happens a lot. Citizens who are very happy that is coming their way, but they of course have a way to show their appreciation or their support other than just saying it. They have no channels to promote this. So we have to sort of do our best to enlarge their interest. And then there's people who have both no interest and no influence or power. So then these people, we don't have to be too worried about them, but we have to know who they are. So essentially in the stakeholder analysis, what we have to do is that we have to have a very clear idea of who they are and identify them clearly and understand what their interests are. The stakeholder analysis is a full methodology that has been developed by many different projects. It has different variations. There's one which was done by GIZ and IDB, and it's pretty straightforward. Basically, you have people who are very supportive or very much opposed or in the middle. And what you do in a stakeholder analysis is that you identify the group, then you understand their perceived problems, you get hold of their interests, what they can do, which is what their mandates are, formally or informally, and the resources that they can dedicate to either promoting or stopping the BRT. There's very detailed methodologies about stakeholder analysis. I mean, but essentially what you do is that you look for these people, you engage them, you have interviews with them, and then you start to systematize the information. What you end up doing with a stakeholder analysis, and then you'll see one example in the BRT Planning Guide, is a table with all these issues. Which is the group, which is their perceived problem, which is their interest or interests, what are their mandates, and which are their resources. So the stakeholder analysis is pretty useful for this first step, to understand the population. And here what we know is who are those groups which are going to help me, and then I can create this table and this sort of map. There's another methodology that basically identifies the stakeholders in this map, so that you can see how well off, if you are in the all the key players are there, and there's very few people who are against the project, and you're fine. So then this first step of doing the stakeholder analysis is something very useful. Just to go a little bit back, the BRT Planning Guide has a description of a lot of tools. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to mention 2 or 3 more. But when you go there, you can see sort of more characteristics of each of these. I think the stakeholder analysis is a first step, and very, very useful step. But then you have other tools such as the focus groups. And the focus group is basically, you can do the stakeholder analysis, or you can do it for concrete steps of the BRT planning process. This specific picture is when we did this. The examples that I'm going to be talking about mostly in the rest of the webinar, and we were trying to improve the science of Transmilenio and the information of the Transmilenio system, OTA. So focus groups are basically a methodology that it's generally called the rapid assessment technique, where what we have is basically it's a group interview. You have a lot of people, normally from a specific segment of the population, either a level of income or an occupation or a geographic area of the city. And what you do is that you go through focus points. It's sort of a focal point of, let's first talk about this topic, let's then talk about this other topic. And you're not explaining them anything, you're just asking them about stuff. So the focus group is not something where you present a project. You can do a very brief presentation, but the focus group is basically something which can last 2 hours, where you're basically asking people what they think. And as a moderator, what you do is that you are focusing on each of the topics that you have predefined with project planners, for example, and you don't push people to agree with you. You're just asking them about stuff. You do moderate, but you anyway ask them about this. What's good about this is that there's experts in focus groups, and there's a lot of people who know very well how to do this. So many times what you do is that you have an expert in doing focus groups, which is moderating, and then you have a technical expert who is sitting in the table and helping with clarifications or anything else, but not doing a full presentation about, for example, the system. So this is a tool that it's very useful. It's sometimes expensive to use or to implement, but it's anyway something which is really useful to do when you really need to understand what people are thinking about either the BRT as a project or the strategy that you're going to be developing. Media normally uses focus groups, but they have sort of a little bit of a different methodology than social sciences. Because I'm a social scientist, then I sort of think about this more in an in-depth way of understanding people's perception rather than asking them about a specific project or a product of a system. And then of course you have surveys. I don't explain surveys in great detail. I mean, it's a series of questions which have normally some options to answer, and then people can respond, and you should look for a representative sample. Normally you try to do surveys and focus groups because then you have the two extremes. You have something which is very qualitative, a lot of people talking about a topic, and you have the survey, which is a very concrete questions with very concrete answers. When you don't know anything about people's perception about the BRT system, which is normally the case when you're starting, you should begin by the focus groups, have a better understanding of the key issues that you're going to ask about, and then go to designing the survey. Because then the focus group will inform the structure of the survey, will give you a better idea about the different options. In some cases, you have a very good idea. So then what you do is that you already define the survey, implement the survey, and then based on the answers that you get, you go in depth into the questions or the answers that you got that you didn't really understand. So then you can go both ways. It's not one first and then the other. You just have to decide based on the information that you have and the interest that you have in either going in depth into a particular topic or exploring first and then going more in detail into the representative sample. Maybe many people who are in this webinar are engineers. Engineers are very smart when it comes to engineering. They love quantitative stuff. When we talked, or I talk to engineers, it's a little bit of a battle when you're talking about the qualitative side of things. And it's very important to understand the results of the focus groups, the results of the stakeholder analysis. These will not give you percentages of anything. Focus groups and stakeholder analysis are a fully qualitative account where you're not expecting a representative sample of any sort, but you're doing you're getting the more sort of comprehensive view. The survey does give you percentages, it does give you the specific answers, but it lacks this depth of understanding of the other two. So you really should try and do both of these. So that's sort of the things that I thought were more useful in the time that we have for that first chapter, which is chapter 9. But of course, there's a lot more things that you can see in the chapter, and I invite you to read it. Then comes the chapter 10. This was a chapter that was originally not so, it wasn't really expected that anybody would write a full chapter on participation. But then it was Lake and I who pushed everybody else to say, we need a full chapter on public participation. When you see the BRT planning guide and it's very, very long content, it's because these things sort of, we were all very excited about this new version of the BRT planning guide. We knew that there were things that we really needed to address that had not been addressed anywhere else, and that we really could write something about. So this topic of participation is something where in transport you don't get a lot of a detailed document, or you don't get a lot of documents in not very, very technical or only being read by social science. What we wanted here is to present the rationale of having participation, when to have participation, and why it's important to have this. I'm going to go very much into these things. Of course, there's a little bit of issues related to how to do surveys, how to do focus groups also, that I sort of presented in the previous section. But I'm going to go more in depth into the specifics of why do we do this and why are we talking so much about public participation. This graph is from another publication that I did, but I think it's very useful to explain the importance of participation. Some author in 1967, this guy Arnstein, said, okay, we have a ladder, and this ladder of participation has different rungs and 3 sort of major sections. There's something which is normally called participation, but it's actually not participation. Sadly, this is what is generally done in transport projects. So you get a lot of people in a room and you tell them, this is what we're going to do, and leave 5 minutes for questions after 2 hours. And then they say, well, I don't agree. And they say, well, right, but we're already starting to build the project. This is really not participation. This guy Arnstein said this is manipulation or therapy. I'm sort of manipulating you to say, sign here the list of participants that came to this participatory workshop. But it was really a long presentation on the key issues of a project that has already been designed. Or basically people try to convince participants that it's a wonderful project. Again, this is not participation. This is just information, and it should not be classified as participation in the sense that we're going to talk in this chapter. Next level is just tokenism. It's sort of, yeah, I'm sort of inviting you, sort of talking to you, but I'm not really paying attention. And then there's one that it's really difficult to achieve. It's really difficult for BRT system planners to really engage with this idea. And it's essentially giving citizens the power to define the project. So what you're trying to do is that you're trying to get them, everybody on board with the design of the project. So you go as early as possible in the project and ask people about this. Project planners don't like this in any project. BRT planners do not like this, to go really at the beginning and say, how would you like the system to be? And the main concerns are two. One of the concerns of not doing this in a true participant is that the project may be delayed because you have to adjust based on feedback from citizens. And essentially the second one is that you have to change, and that your wonderful plans of design have to change. What needs to be understood is that it's good to change according to what citizens think, because you're not only doing a better project, you're doing a project that people are understanding that they're getting at. You're engaging with people and get their views, and what you're getting at is a design that is different from what technically you wanted, but exactly what people need. This is sort of the main issue behind participation in this design, and why you want people to get. Another example of why, sort of another way of explaining it, and this is the way that the BRT Planning Guide is presenting it, and this is a drawing done by Lake to explain this. It's sort of, you have two ways to do this. You have a one-way top-down thing, where it's basically the planner saying, okay, I'm going to explain to everybody what I'm going to do. I have the power to do this, and I'm the one who knows. And then everybody else just has to sit and listen. This really has the problem that people will eventually say that they didn't like it. Of course they'll like a BRT. Of course they'll like a BRT where they have less travel time. But they would support it even more if they can be from the beginning of the system planning. What I normally say in things is that if you get them to buy into your project to the extent that they can say, I was part of that design, they will defend the system much more than if you just tell them, okay, I'm going to explain what we're going to do, and period. So then the second way is this active participatory approach. It's when, as I was saying, you get everybody on board, you have this two-way horizontal view. And then what we have is people saying exactly what you're thinking, and then you're getting their feedback. I saw that somebody was raising their hand, but I think Christina can help me having them give their question, and then maybe I can answer through the Q&A or any other way. I have the full screen. Yeah?
Yes, if you could please direct your questions to the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. The reason we do that is because we download all the questions at the end and we can share them together. Thank you.
Yeah, so there's this button that you can find that says Q&A, and then you can write it there, and we can get back to this. Okay. Okay, so we have the passive and active, and okay, so what I was saying is you have these two, the passive approach, and then you have the active approach where you have real participation. This is the two ways of explaining this, and which is really useful to sort of start understanding. It will be longer at the beginning of the project. It will give you less headaches when you have the project ongoing and when you have everything being done in the development. So this is sort of the thrust of the participation chapter. It does have more on the focus groups and the surveys. I had just presented it in the previous section. There's a question that I'm going to take already. I think it's useful to already respond now because we're getting at we're in the end of this chapter, and it's about how to resolve conflicting expectations. And I think that's really useful question. We normally think that participation means giving everybody what they want. It's not that. We will give many people what they want, but we will be able to find a balance between their interests, their opinions, and the thrust of the project. So for instance, many times you'll get a lot of people who say, I don't want the BRT to go on in front of my home because I don't like it. And it's the typical NIMBYism approach. And what we have is that so you really, there's people who will always be experts. You have to understand them. You have to get their views. You have to give them the opportunity to speak. And you have to either make decisions that improve the designs or the development of the project so that they can address those concerns. Or you can then find that this concern is only from them. It's a specific person having a specific concern that is not really related to the improvement of the overall livelihood of citizens. And then you must be very clear that regardless of the fact that one person has a particular opinion, then you don't want to sort of engage that question in a way that you're going to change the whole project. This happens basically in that sense, that people don't want the BRT to go their way, or they want the station to be closer to them, but really you're not going to be discussing the details of the very, very specifics of the system with everybody. You may get to a point where you do a charrette or something and you get their views, but what's important is that you really engage with them, you really understand their views, you anyway make decisions which are going to be balanced, and then find a way to continue with the project. There's a related question about the hijacking of these participatory processes. There's a lot of literature on this topic. There's a lot of complete books on doing participatory governance. Of course, I guess you know about the participatory budgeting experiences in starting from Brazil. The fact that you do a fully participatory process is going to help you balance out those special interest groups that are going to be voicing their concerns very loudly. If you have meetings with neighbors in the places where the BRT is going to be designed and implemented, the neighbors are not going to be all with the same agenda. It would be something that would be very specific to I mean, it would be very difficult to find a time where you have a very large group of people saying exactly the same because they were influenced by a special interest group. It may happen that there's a very specific group which has a very specific interest and says, I don't want, for example, people in a building and then the building has to be torn down because the BRT will go that way. That's a very specific problem and you must address it with them, but you won't get a lot of other people saying, well, the project shouldn't continue. But the important thing to note here is that having full participation will benefit the full project, and it will reduce the chance of special groups or special interest groups to say, nobody has asked us, we haven't been doing this, and this is what we want. Of course, this is a complex topic. I'm going to be balancing what we're talking about and what we can sort of what I can address here and what we can sort of take further. And I think it's important. The next chapter is going to be talking a little bit more about marketing and the specifics of the system, so there may be the others of the questions that you were talking about. And the other questions that we have are a little bit too detailed for what we're going to talk about, but I'm going to try and sort of address both of these, the educative aspect without forcing these views, and the reorganization of the paratransit system. So just briefly about those things. Participation is one thing where you get everybody's views. It doesn't mean that you have to say, okay, you are all right, everything that you say is right, and then what I'm going to do is going to address everything. You can give them education. What I mean is that you don't need to only inform people. You have to inform them. You have to tell them what it's going to be about. But participation is about the other process, which is getting people's views. You can tell them the benefits of the BRT. You must tell them how it can improve livelihoods. But you must also address the interests of these different groups. So I think that's I mean, it's not either or, it's both. You have to both inform people about the project, give them information about what we're going to be happen, educate them about the different views and why technically it would be better to do this. But it's much better when you understand populations, when you engage them in these participatory workshops, and when you start to talk to them more directly about the project. And then you can inform and educate and tell everybody else about the project. Because there's another question of why shouldn't we be marketing to car commuters? That's a very specific question for this topic, but I'll do my best to sort of explain this a little bit more in the next chapter. I see a lot of people talking on the questions on the comments box, but I as Christina was saying, it's better if you go to the other button that says Q&A. And that's much easier for me to also address those questions through the Q&A. Because the comments are, I mean, I see that there's a lot of different comments.
Hi, Carlos.
Okay.
I addressed some of the comments, so yeah, I'll direct them to you if they're a question.
Okay, perfect. Anyway, I think that the conflicting expectation thing I was sort of explaining earlier, how to, I mean, it's anyway not about finding an agreement at the end of the participatory process. It's about understanding people, moving forward, taking people's perceptions and opinions in mind to the best of everybody's interests. There's this third chapter. This chapter is pretty long. It has a lot of different things. It basically goes into branding. Branding is something that is very well researched. It's very clear for marketing experts. It's media know very well how to do branding. So we don't really, I'm not going to go into depth here. I suggest that you read the chapter to see a little bit more in detail what it says about that. Same as in the concept and the research. I'm going to talk much more about one topic that I think is crucial to understand in BRT planning, and that it's really, there's very, very little literature about this, about the wayfinding, the maps, how to get people to really understand the system, and how to get them to really be able to use the system with an aid of the wayfinding and not another way differently. So the very, very sort of typical marketing things I'm not going to be addressing so much in detail. I'm going to go more into those specific things, and I'm going to be talking about from a specific project that we were doing in Bogota that I was mentioning before. I'm going to talk a little bit about marketing itself, but I'll also address you to the chapter itself, and I'll be mentioning some other resources that I've had the chance to develop in that sense. But I'm going to be talking mostly about the wayfinding, the customer service, and how do these things combine themselves. This chapter was, we had done a draft of this chapter with Juan Pablo Rioseco from Steer Davis Gleave. It was, that was taken as a resource to develop the current version of the chapter by Peter Trickett. So it has a thrust of his writing. So I'm going to explain a little bit more about the other things. We had done a specific chapter on wayfinding and signaling, but then it was combined into this for marketing and customer service. And then Jamila and Liz were supporting this as well. The picture on the left, and this is why I'm so interested in this topic. The left picture is currently, still today, the BRT map for Bogota. You can't see anything, basically because that's what you would see when you arrive at the station. Nobody ever looks at this map. Nobody has any idea what it says, except for the engineers who designed it after many years and maybe decades of learning about transport. The main message here is that users of a BRT are not experts in transport. They're not experts in logistics. They have no idea about complex systems. In many cities, public transport users, there's a segment who don't know how to read. So you have a big challenge in wayfinding and in developing maps. And it's basically that you need people to understand it, and you need to develop something where people really find their way, know where they're going, know what service to take. The one on the right is the one for Transjakarta. There was a support from ITTP here. And at least here you start to see which are the lines with a schematic approach of doing the map of the city. And then at least you know more or less where a particular station is, how you can get there, if there's a specific line that takes you there. And it's much clearer this way than just having a long list of the different services without any spatial indication about if it's going north, south, east, or west, or if it's turning or not. So the Transmilenio map is basically the best example of what not to do. There's been a little bit of improvement over the years, but because of the system complexity, basically the recommendation that we've been giving them in many cases is that they should not have this map, but rather a screen, because if the system is so complex that nobody will understand it, then you might as well have a screen explaining to people. Of course, this is the typical example of the user looking at a map as if it were an ancient map with hieroglyphics. It's not ancient, but it does have hieroglyphics, and you have to understand. For a long while, you have to try and understand what's there. If you see this case, they at least have one map of the full system in the left, and then that should be sort of the main map that they have, and then further explanation should be given by people and not by a printed map. We did one experience where we looked at people in front of the map and timed them. So we took the time that it took for people to look at the map and then continue their way. And there were people who took more than 80 seconds in front of the map, which is really a lot. When you want to get home, when you want to get someplace, spending more than a full minute looking at a map, trying to understand it, is just too much. What was interesting is that after this, we looked at how many people kept on doing something else in order to understand where they should go. So basically what we started finding is that people do not like the map, do not understand it, and even if they spend a lot of time, they will never know what this map is showing them. And then we started to do a little bit of exercises to say, okay, let's simplify things. Let's show people the map of the city represented in the different lines that we have. Let's make it clear that there's a letter and a color assigned to each of these services. And then let's start to get things from there and try to explain what is there. This question is really interesting, the one that we found from Tarley. There is a lot of complexity in many maps. In BRT, this is especially important. BRT has a characteristic in many cases where you don't have just current services, like services stopping at each station, but you also have express services. The express services are extremely useful for a BRT in terms of operation. When users understand the express service, this is everything that they want to take. They love express services, especially when they don't stop for ages. So this is the huge challenge in a BRT. How do you get this very complex system that is very useful for users to get them to understand? I'm going to talk more about this a little bit later, but I just wanted to acknowledge this. It is difficult to find a solution for BRT when the very definition of BRT is the complexity of the operations that make it much more efficient. But you have to find a way to communicate this to users clearly with maps and with other things so that they don't get lost. So I don't have such a long list of things. I'm not showing everything that we did in this specific exercise of Transmilenio, but what we did there was also that we would follow people walking and we would see where people were going specifically. And we would look at, I have a slide on here. So we would look at what they would do. So they would look at the map, then review the map with their hand, then look at the signals in the station. But this is the interesting thing. They would ask another user, they would ask Transmilenio staff or a policeman, and then many times they would look at, basically they would look at where the bus was going. And this was their main source of information. They would just sit there and say, okay, this is the one that I need. The problem is in many cases, this is not, I don't have that graph here, but what we looked at was the people would get into the bus and many times ask people inside the bus if that bus stopped where they wanted to go, which is a very good idea in the sense that people who are in the bus are the ones who know, but it's a very bad idea if the bus closes its doors and takes you for 30 stations without stopping in an express service. So then what we started to find was that getting staff in the station to engage with users was the most effective. This was something we found out. It's sort of standard practice in high quality transit systems. It's pretty expensive to do, but it's the most efficient way, especially when you have a station which has a lot of interchanges, or when you have a very new system, or when you're introducing services or creating new services or changing the routes of specific services. The maps by themselves will never do the job. The maps are good for permanent information, for sort of secondary source of information, but people will normally look for system staff or police or other users. So you should really find ways to combine the two, which are the different ways. There's something which is not in the BRT planning guide because we didn't have the time to include it at the end, but what some systems are doing is that they're actually in the system doors, they're indicating the services and the specific stops of those services in the doors of, in front of the doors of the bus. And then many people find it very useful because then they can go directly to the doors of the bus and see if any of the services that are there can give them the information that they need. But then I just wanted to note that it's this balancing of different information that will give people the better clue. One other thing that is important to note, and that is based on also on sort of design practice and proper design practice, is that what I'm saying is complement the different modes of wayfinding and explaining to users, but don't saturate the station with 100 different maps because that won't be useful. Just find a best place to show a very large map that shows the full system, and also find another place where you can give complementary information, and then have signage that is very clear, that is very simple, that explains people very directly what they need to do in order to walk around the station. So that's sort of rounding up on this idea of improving. There's one thing that I always want to talk about. It's the fact that there's very different users of very different capabilities. There's a lot of disabilities. You need to engage with them. There's from people who are fully blind, people who are colorblind, people who are very short and needs to get into the station properly, to need to be able to see the map properly, and it's something which is difficult to engage with, and it's difficult to address in a BRT or in any public transport system. This picture is from one station in Stuttgart that is fully accessible to everyone, and it has a copper braille a map of the system. This is like the most elaborate way to engage with people who either don't see well or are fully blind. But it's of course really expensive to do. We did in another exercise, we talked to people with different disabilities. It was a focus group where we got different representatives of people in wheelchairs, people who couldn't see well, people who had cognitive disabilities, people who were not tall, colorblind people. The conclusion of our focus group is that there was not a single ideal map that could cater to everybody's needs. But we could start to find ways where a map would not be so difficult for the person who would not see so much, that we could find a way to address the needs of people who were fully blind, that we should never use colors which were difficult for the colorblind person to note, or the different combinations of colors shouldn't be too much. And then we started to find sort of rules that would at least help us in producing something which would not be completely different or completely difficult or just impossible for them to understand. And the combination of proper maps, proper information, audible, or even staff in the system would help them. Because those system staff are the people who in the end are going to be telling people where they should go, helping them go a specific place, and the ones who fully understand the system. The photo in the left is a specific location in Transmilenio terminals for user information. And then you have one person who's explaining absolutely everything that they have to know about the system. There's something very interesting about Transmilenio, and it's that they never provide system maps, printed system maps. You can't get them, it's really difficult. But then at least they have all these resources there. And then the terminal stations, it's really important because that's when you're starting to change from the interurban bus to getting to a system that may be the first time that you're there. So then the system staff are budget-wise a very, very big cost. Having 2 people in each station is a considerable cost for the system, but you must contemplate this, at least in the stations which have a lot of interchange, where the places people arriving, the moment of the system, new services, changes of services, this kind of thing is something that is really important. And then, of course, you have the digital live information. This is very useful when you use it properly and when your system has a very reliable information system and a control center. When you see the other components of the BRT planning guide, you'll see that the control center is very important, that you have to give information to people, and that you need to have good tracking of the buses. In some cases, you don't have such good tracking of when the bus will arrive, either because it's in mixed traffic, and that makes it really to provide reliable information, or because the stoplights are not synchronized with system operation and you don't have information on stoplights, or because you have a lot of either encroachments or people driving their cars and not stopping at the right place and then blocking the BRT, or in cases you even have protests. I mean, the BRT is good because the service system which is integrated in the city, but because of that same, it's very, I mean, in many cases it has risks of being blocked or traffic being too much, and then the cross traffic is just blocking the system. So then this is difficult to have reliable systems of live information. People love information. This is relatively easy to set up when you have a proper control center, but people only like it when it's telling them the truth every time, or at least that it's not terribly giving the wrong information. So of course it's a wonderful complement, but it has to be very clear, it has to be very precise, or as precise as possible regarding the information that you have. If you really don't know the timing, just don't put the timing. It's horrible. One thing that is very important to know is that users perceive time spent in the station 3 times longer than the actual time spent. So if they've spent 2 minutes, they say they've spent 6. If they spent 5 minutes, they say they spent 15 minutes. So when you tell them minutes from the bus to arrive, you should be very precise, or just don't show it at all. You can just say the next bus coming is this one, and then just don't give information on the time if you're not having a reliable system to track this. But of course, this is sort of another component that is pretty useful. I have a few 3 minutes left, so I'm just going to note 2 more things. There's another document that GIs had just published on that could be complementary to this, and it's sort of a promotional strategy, how to create a promotional strategy, specifically as promotional strategy for sustainable transport. And then it's a little bit similar to what we have in these chapters of the communications volume and BRT, creating a team, defining the goals, identifying the groups, gathering information and reviewing goals, designing and implementing a strategy, and monitoring and reviewing. This can sort of sum up some of the steps that I was identifying here that I think are useful. And one thing I need to mention before finishing is that we should never have this type of publicity. Of course, car companies, motorbike companies are going to be very happy to give you a lot of money for ads in the system. But what this is creating is basically people leaving the system because they see these other options. The first chance they have, they will leave. So having this type of advertising is annoying. And of course, the system will get a little bit more revenue from it, but you shouldn't accept this type of publicity. And it happens a lot in BRT. Of course, because people who are selling motorbikes, the first customer they want is somebody who is not using a motorbike. The most direct customer they will have is the person who is riding public transport. So I would never recommend having this type of publicity, because in the long run, the system will go broke. because people already went to all these cars or motorbikes that are being sold inside the system. So it's having your competition within your market, and they will take advantage of that. This was, I mean, I hope that this was useful for you to see. I'm finishing right on time. I'm leaving there my email in case you would have any further questions. But in the end, please go to the BRT planning guide, read the whole thing, or read it by sections, or be aware of the fact that we need to integrate people's views, that we need to design the system bearing those views in mind, and that we, despite the fact that we will take a little bit longer, that we'll have a better chance to do a one successful and system that everybody loves. So it's what I want to present, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carlos, for this presentation today, and for all of you who have attended.